The father charged years after his 3 sons vanished, 3 boys disappear. No witnesses, no clear evidence, just silence. At first, it looked like a custody situation gone wrong. Maybe a father trying to keep his children a little longer than he should. But as hours turned into days, and days into years, that explanation stopped making sense because the boys never came back. No confirmed sightings, no contact, nothing. And the one person who was last with them? Their father. For years he denied everything. No arrests, no charges. Just a case that seemed to fade into the background. Until suddenly, it didn't. Because after all this time, investigators made a move no one was expecting. And it changes everything. The case centers on a man named Chad Dorman and the 3 boys who, for a brief moment, were simply reported as missing. But what unfolded was far more serious and far more devastating than anyone initially expected. It happened in June 2023 in a quiet rural area of Monroe Township. At first, emergency calls described a chaotic situation involving children in danger. Details were unclear. Neighbors heard distress. Law enforcement rushed to the scene without fully understanding what they were walking into. When officers arrived, they found something that immediately escalated the situation. 3 young boys, later identified as brothers, had been reported missing from the property. But unlike typical missing person cases, this one didn't involve a search stretching across neighborhoods or forests. Everything pointed back to one place, the family home, and more specifically, to their father. In the earliest moments, authorities were trying to piece together what had happened. The timeline was tight. The boys had last been seen with their father, and there was no indication that they had wandered off or been taken by someone else. That alone shifted the focus of the investigation almost instantly. But what made the situation even more urgent was the behavior reported at the scene. Witnesses described panic, confusion, a sense that something had gone terribly wrong within minutes. Officers quickly secured the area and began searching the immediate surroundings. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The 3 boys were located on the property, and it was immediately clear that this was no longer a missing person case. This was a homicide investigation. From that point forward, everything moved quickly. Chad Dorman was taken into custody at the scene without resistance. According to initial reports, he did not attempt to flee. In fact, his demeanor was described as unusually calm given the circumstances. That detail stood out to investigators, because in many cases involving sudden violence, there's chaos, panic, or attempts to escape. But here, the situation appeared controlled, almost as if whatever had happened was deliberate rather than impulsive. As authorities began their preliminary investigation, more details started to emerge. The boys, ages 3, 4, and 7, were all from the same family. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence suggesting an outside suspect. Everything pointed inward, toward the household itself. And then came one of the most chilling aspects of the case. According to prosecutors, there were indications that the act had been planned, not spontaneous, not accidental, planned. That claim would later become a central part of the charges. Investigators also spoke with family members and witnesses who were present or nearby at the time. Their accounts helped establish a clearer timeline of events, narrowing down exactly when things unfolded and who was involved. But even as those details became clearer, one question remained difficult to process. Why? There was no immediate explanation that made sense. No public record of escalating violence leading up to that moment. No obvious trigger that could explain such an extreme act, which is often what makes cases like this so disturbing. They don't follow a predictable pattern. They don't give warning signs that are easy to recognize after the fact. Instead, they leave behind a gap between what was known before and what is understood after that feels impossible to reconcile. And as the investigation moved forward, that gap only grew wider. Because what authorities would soon reveal about the events of that day would make the case even more unsettling. As the investigation progressed, authorities began assembling a clearer picture of what had happened inside the home that day. And with each new detail, the case became even more disturbing. Not because of complexity, but because of how direct and deliberate it appeared to be. According to prosecutors, Chad Dorman was formally charged with multiple counts of aggravated murder. The charges reflected not just the loss of life, but the alleged level of intent behind the act. During early court proceedings, officials outlined evidence suggesting that the incident was not a sudden outburst, but something that had been thought through in advance. Statements presented indicated that Dorman had, at some point, lined up the children before the act occurred. That claim, if accurate, pointed to a level of control and awareness that is difficult to comprehend. It wasn't just what happened, it was how it happened. And that distinction would become central to how the case was prosecuted. One of the most critical aspects of the investigation was witness testimony. Family members who were present or nearby during the incident provided accounts that helped establish a sequence of events. These testimonies, combined with physical evidence collected at the scene, formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. Emergency calls placed during the incident also became key pieces of evidence. In those calls, panic and urgency were evident. They captured the moment when confusion turned into realization, when it became clear that something irreversible had taken place. But even with that evidence, the legal process required careful examination. Defense attorneys began exploring potential explanations, including questions about mental state. In cases involving extreme violence within families, courts often consider whether the accused was fully aware of their actions or capable of understanding the consequences at the time. However, prosecutors pushed back strongly against that angle. They emphasized the structured nature of the events, the sequence, the control, the absence of hesitation, as indicators that the act was intentional and premeditated. According to their argument, the evidence did not support a loss of control, but rather a deliberate decision. As hearings continued, more procedural steps followed. Bail was denied. The charges remained severe, and the case moved toward trial. Outside the courtroom, the impact of what happened continued to ripple through the community. A quiet area that had rarely seen major incidents suddenly found itself at the center of national attention. Neighbors struggled to process how something like this could occur so close to home. And perhaps the most difficult part for many people to understand was the contrast. On one side, there was the image of an ordinary family life, routine, familiar, unremarkable. On the other, there was an act so extreme that it seemed to come from nowhere. That contrast is what often makes cases like this feel especially unsettling. They don't fit into clear categories, they don't follow expectations, and they leave behind questions that don't have simple answers. As of now, the case remains within the legal system, where evidence will be examined in full and arguments from both sides will be presented. The outcome will ultimately depend on how that evidence is interpreted in court. But regardless of the legal result, the core of the story doesn't change. 3 lives were lost, a family was shattered, and a case that began with confusion quickly turned into something far more serious than anyone initially imagined. It's a reminder that not all cases unfold slowly over years. Some happen in moments and leave consequences that last far longer. And even when the facts are laid out clearly, understanding the why can remain just out of reach. If you want more real stories like this, told clearly, without confusion, and focused on what actually happened, make sure you like this video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because some stories aren't just shocking, they stay with you long after they're over.